Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit and welcome to the obligatory Top 10 Games of 2014 video. The usual rules apply. Top 10 games of 2014 are determined entirely by the things that I enjoyed the most this year. That means if a game is missing from the list, I either did not enjoy it as much as stuff on this list, or I did not play it, which is why it isn't there. This year has actually been a bit rough for me, as you've probably heard. There's been an ongoing health issue, which I very much hope will be resolved in the next few months. So I've got to play less games than I otherwise would have wanted to, which is maybe for the best. 2014 has perhaps not been the best year for games, but as per every year, there are still plenty of things worth playing. So, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I give you my top 10 games that I enjoyed in 2014. Number 10. Guilty Gear Excerpt. This one is a little bit of a late entry to the list, as you might imagine, because it's only been available on home console since December in Western countries. It actually came out in February of this year in the Japanese arcades. And it's, of course, the latest entry to the Guilty Gear franchise, which I've liked for quite some time. I remember being originally very impressed by Guilty Gear X, which came out on the Dreamcast. At that time, of course, we were dealing with visuals that would go up to 480p at most with a VGA cable. And one of the most impressive looking games on that system was Guilty Gear X, because it had these very high quality hand-drawn sprites, which were completely different to other 2D fighters of the time. And that's not to say, of course, that there weren't some amazing 2D fighters on the Dreamcast. There were plenty, things like, of course, Marvel vs. Capcom 2, Street Fighter Third Strike, Vampire Chronicles, King of the Fighters. There were plenty of them, but this one stood out as just looking a hell of a lot better because they were higher quality hand-drawn models as opposed to the pixely models that you saw in other games. So it was mind-blowingly impressive. This was complemented nicely by the unusual character design and backed up by a really cool, if somewhat cheesy rock soundtrack, and Guilty Gear Xrd does not disappoint when it comes to that heritage. You've got a wide selection of very odd-looking characters indeed, with very strange backstories, a fantastic soundtrack. I'm sorry, I love the cheesy rock, or butt rock as a lot of people like to call it. It's phenomenal. And what they managed to do with Xrd is take what is traditionally a 2D fighting game, put it in a 3D engine, but maintain the fact that it is a 2D fighting game. It's still all done on a 2D plane, but there are times during the match when the perspective will shift, such as, say, a dust attack, which is a knock-up, and then if you perform a follow-up, it will shift the camera perspective as you do it. It's also got some absolutely incredible intros and outros that look like they were animated for a feature film. But as it turns out, it's all done in engine, which is ridiculously impressive. I was a bit worried when I heard that they were going to put Guilty Gear in the Unreal 3 engine, because I thought there's no way they can possibly translate the aesthetic. But they did, and the result of that is a really compelling, awesome-looking fighting game with plenty of mechanical depth and absolutely stellar presentation. Number 9. The Last Federation. There are some games that I enjoy because they're mechanically superb. There are some games that I enjoy because they told a really interesting story. And there are some games that I enjoy because they gave me a very unique story of my own to tell. And that's what Last Federation managed to do. So the developer of The Last Federation is a small studio by the name of Arkan, and they've been making some niche games for quite some time that always have some really interesting ideas behind them and some very odd mechanics, and they don't necessarily implement the ideas through the mechanics in a great way. Sometimes they manage to do it really well, sometimes they don't, sometimes their games are very complex and have a relatively high barrier to entry, such as their superb AI war. But along comes Last Federation and says, well, this is sort of a reverse 4X. You're not empire building, you are helping empires that already exist, and you're being something of a political agent within this particular universe. It's your job to create a federation between empires which are otherwise at each other's throats. And the way that you do that is really fairly free form, and you can take on a wide variety of different activities in order to manipulate and influence the various factions, play them off against each other, and of course do a little bit of your own combat with a ship which can be upgraded with stolen technology. Interestingly enough, the combat system is a very odd take on the shmup idea. It's basically a turn-based shmup. You plan your route, and you target your weapons in various places and activate various abilities, and then you let a few seconds of the game play out. You can literally dodge projectiles by pausing it and changing your trajectory. It's really quite interesting and surprisingly fun to do, but the big thing about Last Federation is the stories that you can tell because of all of the subterfuge and political nonsense that you're able to perpetrate throughout the game. Indeed, the moment that stuck with me the most was when I was able to achieve universal peace through the medium of toxic genocide, convincing a race of robotic CEOs to dump all of their toxic waste on the one planet whose army I simply could not crack, even with the power of everybody else in the system. The tactic ended up being so effective that the developer nerfed it, and that was something which really stuck with me. That was a really cool moment, and I love the idea that instead of controlling an all-powerful empire, you're simply a devious creature that has the ability to play one off against another. There are very few games that do faction warfare particularly well, and Last Federation is built on the very notion of faction warfare and political intrigue. If nothing else, you can argue that it's an extremely interesting game. Number 8. Fibbage. Fibbage is now available as part of the Jackbox Party Pack, which gives you a version which has a bunch more content in it. But what exactly is Fibbage? It's a party game. It's made by the folks that brought you You Don't Know Jack, which is a very long-running quiz series, and Fibbage is all about lying. The principle could not be simpler. You are given a category, and the game presents you with an obscure question. You are then tasked with inputting an answer, which is supposed to be as believable as possible, and the goal of the game is to fool people into believing that your answer is actually the correct one. It's a very simple but effective concept. It's something that could easily be done with cards and a table, but in this case what they do is they put it on a big TV screen, and they let you use your tablets and your smartphones as controllers, and that I think is extremely innovative. It handily gets around the problem of having to deal with faffing around and buying new controllers. They use things which people generally have on their person, smartphones, and they use those as the controller. And it's not just that, because while it's nice to be able to replace controllers with something that people just happen to have on their person anyway, the genius is allowing those devices to be used to hide information from the other people. It gives you your own individual screen, which opens up a whole world of new gameplay possibilities. And what I ideally hope is that these ideas are taken and used in games in 2015 and beyond, because I love the notion of information asymmetry, the idea that you know something that other people don't. It's the core idea behind some of the most entertaining board and tabletop games that I've played, and being able to implement that into something which is a couch game, a party game implemented either on a PC or a console, is really, really fun. I had a blast with Fibbage. We had some of the best laughs of the year with that game, and at the end of the day, this is a list about games that I enjoyed, and I enjoyed laughing at Fibbage. It's that simple. Number 7. This War of Mine. I debated even putting this on the list because I made an argument this year that games don't have to be fun, they have to be compelling. I don't think that's a new argument. I think most people have already realized this, and the people claiming that games don't have to be fun, as if it was some kind of deep intellectual commentary, are somewhat deluded or just a little bit silly. But the fact of the matter is that This War of Mine is not fun in the traditional sense. What it is compelling and challenging. It's a game about a group of civilians attempting to survive in a war zone by upgrading their bombed-out habitat, going out on scavenging missions, and trying not to die or succumb to a variety of other things, including sickness, starvation, and, of course, the biting cold. It's a game about making tough calls. Do you help people around you at the expense of your own resources? Do you take risks? But what's more interesting to me is when you don't have a choice, when you are forced into a tense and dangerous situation simply due to your own survival, and that is a very compelling thing indeed. The game also doesn't shove the idea of emotion down your throat. It's something that allows you to experience for yourself. When you spend a lot of time developing one of your characters and keeping them alive and reading their little diary entries, and then suddenly something horrible ends up happening to them, or you end up having to perpetrate something horrific just to ensure their survival, yes, there is that emotional connection there, and that's done through the gameplay in the way that I personally very much approve of when it comes to video games. I've said it time and time and time again. The best way to convey emotion is to convey it through game mechanics, because that's the unique aspect of this particular medium that allows us to elevate it above non-interactive media. So you could say that I didn't really enjoy This War of Mine at all, but I can say that I got a lot out of it, that I found it extremely compelling. And once again, it gave me an unforgettable moment as I snuck through a house, identified a guard who was carrying a weapon, believing this person to be a bandit, creeping up on them from behind before bludgeoning them to death with a crowbar, only to a few seconds later meet the guard's sister, who collapsed and cried over her corpse. They weren't bandits at all, they were just doing what I'd been trying to do, survive, and due to the effective portrayal of the horrors of war in this war of mine, I'd assumed the worst. Now that is a piece of powerful storytelling. Number 6. Middleearth: Shadow of Mordor. Expectations for this game, at least in my camp, were fairly low because, really, looking at the pre-release footage, it looked like your same old open-world game, a cross between Arkham and Assassin's Creed, and frankly, yet another licensed title that no one had really asked for. But there was one feature that was mentioned in the pre-release hype that I don't think anyone really believed would actually come to fruition in any sort of meaningful and coherent way, and that was the Nemesis system. They promised this notion that you could engage in faction warfare and you could manipulate the hierarchy of the Orcish horde. You could be a kingmaker, replacing generals with orcs that you control. Enemies would remember your name. They would be able to kill you to rank up and gain prestige within the armies of Mordor. All of this sounded great, but it all sounded very similar to things we've heard before when people have said, no, the world will really react to you. It will actually build itself around you and tell unique stories. Well, here's the thing. Mordor actually did. The Nemesis system is robust and very interesting, and it creates unique tales because it creates grudges. I didn't really care about the storyline of Shadow of Mordor. I wasn't particularly invested in taking vengeance for the death of my family. But what I was interested in is taking vengeance on that bastard over there. That little green wanker interrupted me during a mission and stabbed me in the back, and then he got a promotion and mocked me for it. He has to die. I am going to ram his face into a fire and make him wish he was never bloody born. That's the sort of thing that Shadow of Mordor's Nemesis system gives to you. And of course it helped that it was entirely competent in its own right. It took the Arkham system and implemented it very well, which plenty of games have attempted to do and failed. It had an interesting open world that didn't overdo the number of side activities and was in its own way quite beautiful, despite the fact that it was a wretched wasteland. Of the many open world games that came out this year, as far as I'm concerned, this is the best one by a significant margin. Number 5. Metal Gear Rising. I'm cheating, because this game came out in 2013, but not on PC, it didn't. And that, as far as I'm concerned, is enough bloody excuse to put Metal Gear Rising on the list. Hell, if it didn't come out on PC this year, I'd have probably put it on anyway because, well, screw you. I don't need to explain myself to you. For the interests of having a good video, though, I probably should. Metal Gear Rising is from Platinum Games. It is a spectacle fighter, and a glorious one at that. I admit to having very little interest in Metal Gear as a franchise. It's primarily a series of console games, so I never got around to really playing it, and while we will get the Phantom Pain and we do have Ground Zeroes available on PC, the whole stealth action genre is not one that I prefer. Spectacle fighters, on the other hand, or character action games, are very compelling to me, and Metal Gear Rising is among one of the best. It's not one of the hardest, but it has some of the most enjoyable set pieces and excellent moments that abide purely by the rule of cool, and exist perhaps for the sole purpose of being absolutely awesome. The fighting system is simple but elegant, and is backed up by a system which allows you to slice off individual limbs and tiny little parts of whatever the hell you damn well please, which comes along with a counter of how many pieces you cut them into in the first place. It's a fairly visceral piece of joyous nonsense that also has some practical implications and allows for boss fights which require precision cuts. In fact, pretty much all the boss fights in that game are really enjoyable and come along with their own amazing themes. This is one of the soundtracks that I listened to the most this year. It was killer. I played Metal Gear Rising through from start to finish with absolutely no regrets and very few complaints indeed. This game is a fast-paced, completely over-the-top insanity fest that is well worth playing if you're looking for an adrenaline rush. Number 4. Transistor. This is a fairly predictable addition to the list, I think. I gave Bastion my top game of 2011 award, and I've been following Supergiant with great interest since the announcement of Transistor. When I finally got to play the game, I beat the thing in pretty much one sitting and had a very satisfying time of it. It's not the same game as Bastion, not at all. Bastion, if anything, was something of an action RPG. This uses an intriguing tactics system involving a pause screen and a set of abilities which can be customized and comboed together. The mechanical depth of Transistor is often ignored in favor of the stunning aesthetic, music, storytelling, and bloody well everything else. And I think that's perhaps a little bit of a shame, because the one thing that Transistor does which excels in comparison to Bastion is that mechanical complexity. Bastion played well, but at the end of the day it was an isometric action RPG with a few Zelda elements thrown in. It's competent, certainly. You know, it does the job really, really well, but Transistor actually innovates. It creates new game mechanics, and if you actually play this game in New Game Plus, I think you will truly realize just how interesting the combat system is because of the amount of modification and customization that you can put into play with your various abilities and modifiers. The first time through, the game's a little bit easy, and I think it doesn't do a great job of fully flexing its mechanical muscles, because you can beat pretty much anything. Indeed, you can play the entire game through in real time, which I feel is a lesser experience, and you'll still be able to win without too much of a problem. But in New Game Plus, things get a hell of a lot more interesting, and I absolutely loved tweaking with the various abilities and comboing things together to see what strange effects they would have. There are so many interesting combinations to discover. And that's, of course, without talking about the aesthetic, which is mind-blowingly good, an incredible art style, and, of course, an exceptional soundtrack by Darren Korb. It is a short game. It is a fulfilling game. It's pretty much just the right length, as far as I'm concerned, and it's a really satisfying experience. Number 3. One Finger Death Punch. You what, mate? That's probably what's going through your mind at the moment. What is One Finger Death Punch? Not exactly on the level of popularity of a lot of other games on this list, I've got to say. A very small game, a very low-budget game by a studio that has produced some of the worst things that have ever crept onto Xbox Live Indie ever. I mean, just awful, awful video games that have no place on anything. Then they made One Finger Death Punch, and I have absolutely no idea what made them do it. I have no idea how they funded it. I have no idea how they were still in business by the time that they made it. And I have no idea how it ended up being so goddamn good, despite the fact that it looks like it was made by a 5-year-old. I mean, it's a stick figure game. You remember those Stickman fight animations that were on the internet before the internet was the internet, when we were still all using AOL Instant Messenger and or ICQ? Yeah, that in a video game. And it's a very simple game as well. It's really about pressing 2 buttons for the most part at the right time. It's almost a rhythm game. But what it does is create this kinetic kung fu experience that is very, very responsive and feels amazing. Not only that, but even though, of course, it's done with stick figures, the actual on-screen display is bright and colorful and flashy and gives you this incredibly satisfying feedback that emulates an over-the-top kung fu fight in the best possible way. Not only that, but it's packed full of variety, which makes no sense because, again, it's a game based on pressing 2 buttons, but they managed it by giving you different weapons and having different levels with different rule sets. It's this really small, cheap game that looks like it was made to be on Newgrounds or Congregate or whatever, and it ends up being one of the best action titles of the year. It's a heartening success story. It says that one of the best games of the year can come from one of the worst studios in existence, and I feel bad saying that about Silver Dollar, but honestly, I think they would accept that themselves, that the stuff they've released in the past is just tosh. This... You make more of this, and you're going to become one of my favorite developers, so get on it. One Finger Death Punch. Get this game. So good. Number 2. Bayonetta 2. Sequel to my top game of 2010. Along comes Bayonetta 2, and thank you to Nintendo for allowing it to happen, because God knows Sega had no intention of doing so. Bayonetta came out, and it was a striking entry to the spectacle fighter genre, and I still believe probably the best spectacle fighter to have ever been made by anybody. Comes from Platinum, that has a platinum reputation, who of course were ex-Clover Studios guys that made things like God Hand and Okami, which are absolutely incredible video games. Bayonetta 2 is, for the most part, more of the same. But it's more of the same of something that was very, very good indeed. Bayonetta was the best cake you've ever eaten. And 4 years later, you get a chance to have another slice of it. Now, do you complain that the cake is the same cake that you ate 4 years ago, even though it was the best cake you'd ever eaten? No, you don't. You enjoyed the best cake that you've ever eaten again. And this time around, it's got a little bit of different frosting on it. It is perhaps redesigned in an aesthetic way, and it's just been refined just that little bit. And you can taste the more subtle flavors being brought out by a studio learning from its past games and really enhancing their art. And Platinum Games are artists when it comes to spectacle fighters, there's no doubt about that. Bayonetta 2 is an incredibly responsive, visually amazing title. And it ended up on the Wii U, which, surprisingly enough, was the console that had the best core games this year. At least, it had the best core exclusives this year. Ultimately, it's hard to say that the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One had great core games when I can play all of those games better on a PC. I can't play the Wii U games better on a PC, and it had several exclusives that were worth my time, and Bayonetta 2 comes at the top of the list of those titles. I also love Bayonetta as a character. She's so supremely arrogant. She has this aura of intimidating confidence when it comes to everything that she does. She's an inherently sexual character, but not perhaps the common vision of idealized beauty, very much out of proportion. I mean, if you notice how bloody tall she is and how long her back is, she's less of a woman and more of an avatar, this whirling goddess of stylized death dealing. A character that says that if a battle's worth doing, it's worth doing in style, and I absolutely love that. Coupled with incredible art design of both the main character and, of course, all of the enemies that you end up facing is a sublime mechanical experience that is incredibly responsive and has plenty of combo depth within it. Simply put, there is no better spectacle fighter than the Bayonetta series. It just doesn't exist, and if it's made, the chances are it's going to be made by Platinum and probably called Bayonetta 3. Number 1. Wolfenstein The New Order. Huge surprise this year. Let me tell you a story. So, back at PAX, I went to the Bethesda booth and we played Elder Scrolls Online and Wolfenstein The New Order way before they came out. I played Wolfie on an Xbox 360, which was probably a pretty bad decision, but that's what they had available at the time, and I thoroughly hated it. I put out a video preview which slammed the game for about 20 minutes, because what they showed us was this introductory sequence which involved the most boring moments of the entire game cobbled together into one demo. God, it was horrible, and I was extremely concerned that Wolfenstein was becoming Call of Duty, which is what Wolfenstein has never really been, and I've loved all of the Wolfenstein games, including Wolfenstein 2009, that red-headed stepchild. I like that game anyway, and I'll defend that bloody thing to the death. So, let's just say my expectations weren't high going into Wolfenstein The New Order, and my god was I so happy to be wrong! This is the best first-person shooter of the year. This is the best video game of the year. This is an incredible single-player FPS, the likes of which are very difficult to match. It is bombastic, colorful, brutal, enjoyable. It's over the top, it's silly, it's an action movie in video game form, and yet its greatest triumph is not any of those things. It's not Nazi robots, it's not dual-wielded assault rifles. No, it's being able to do all of that and still have a compelling cast of characters that actually have dialogue that's worth a damn. And that game had no right. It had no right to be able to do that because so many more serious games don't pull that off. How did it do it? I don't know. I couldn't explain that to you. I can only explain to you the results of it. These NPCs that I worked together with as a team to achieve my goals and felt a genuine sense of camaraderie, thanks again to great writing and characterization. Tell me, when was the last video game that had a badass main NPC character that was in a wheelchair and used a colostomy bag? Can you? Of course you can't. That's just a really interesting character and well written. And how exactly do you bring in elements of horrors of war and not have it completely conflict with a game that involves you mowing down hundreds of mecha Nazis? Ask Machine Games, because they're the guys that managed to pull that off. It's all backed up by a wonderful soundtrack that not only has the talents of Mick Gordon, whose music I loved in Killer Instinct, but also has this great variety of alternate history versions of classic pop songs, which are all collectible and very enjoyable indeed. And they add to the atmosphere of what, yes, could very well truly be an alt history if the Nazis did happen to win World War II. The game adds so many little pieces of detail to really make you believe in this, frankly, absurd notion. Tiny little snippets of news articles all over the place. I loved reading those because they were so well written, and they seemed like, yes, they would have genuinely happened if these were the events of this particular war. But of course, no FPS would actually work if it didn't have solid shooting mechanics, and this game does. It brings back classic ideas like lean. You know, it's just something simple like being able to lean around a corner. You can use stealth weapons, or you can go in guns blazing. The game doesn't punish you for any of that. There's a decent amount of weapon variety, and there's of course a decent amount of upgrades available for them. And you can dual-wield assault rifles, and pretty much almost any weapon in the game, including marksman sniper rifles. The weapons are packed with interesting alt-fire modes. They all feel punchy and responsive. The game rewards accuracy, but doesn't punish you for going in dual-wielding automatic shotguns, guns a-blazing. It takes the best parts of shooters of old and integrates them into a thoroughly modern experience that is a blast to play. And it's a single-player shooter. We just don't get a great deal of those. They focused all of their time on the single-player campaign, and as a result, what they came up with was an absolute triumph. I played Wolfenstein from start to finish and didn't regret a single second of it. It's the best game of 2014, as far as I'm concerned. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for a great year on the channel, and I'm well aware that we haven't really had the best year in terms of content. Things have been pretty rough from a personal standpoint, and I ideally hope that over the next few months all of that gets resolved and we can go into a 2015 with renewed strength and plenty more videos for you to enjoy. Happy New Year and good health to all, ladies and gentlemen, and I will see you next time.